from boot camp to graduation. Private First Class Maria Dahm has done what many naysayers said a woman would never do.
I just want to shake your hand.
Thank you.
You know, you're part of history. You know that,
Yes,
right?
sir. Thank you.
And that's amazing.
She's the first female Marine to join the infantry through the traditional entry-level training process, a process only made available to women just a half year earlier.
I like to prove people wrong, and just because you're a female, it doesn't mean you can't do what a male can do.
Navigating through woods, sleeping outdoors, and carrying back-breaking loads are par for the course at the School of Infantry.
Help me out, Brendan.
Instructor and Mortar Marine Sergeant Matthew Snyder said not only did Dahm graduate, she often made things look easy.
She was right at the top of the pack.
Her arrival in the infantry comes as a scandal has rocked the Corps. A private Facebook group called Marines United shared links to nude photos of military women, with new links urging them to post only the, quote, nastiest images. Marine Corps Commandant General Robert Neller told lawmakers he is disgusted.
How much more do the females of our Corps have to do to be accepted? We all have to commit to getting rid of this perversion to our culture. Enough is enough.
Dahm just wants to keep moving forward.
It kind of just gives me more motivation to show them that we can do it and just to watch.
Her mother sees a young woman who inspires her, and experts hope her success will persuade more women to join despite the current scandal.
This may be the way to bridge the gap and bring more women into the infantry, and therefore make them feel like colleagues with their infantry counterparts.
Dahm says to her peers here in Camp Lejeune, she wasn't Dahm the female, she was just Dahm. She and 4 of her fellow graduates are off to California, where they hope to blaze new trails together in a place she's never been. Reporting at Camp Lejeune, I'm Carla Babb, VOA News.
The president has faced a lot of criticism for his handling of the war in Afghanistan. I'm hearing from some analysts that he has essentially abdicated responsibility for this war to his generals.
Well, he has, according to Pentagon officials, he has basically said, this is your fight, and this is not my specialty. I'm going to let you do this and figure this out. And so we just learned this week, a few days ago, that Secretary Mattis has been given the authority to set the numbers. I know that he wants to focus not just on the amount of troops on the ground, but the capabilities that they can bring to the fight. So we've been hearing anywhere between about 3,000 to 5,000 U.S. troops. Other officials have said 3,000 to 5,000 international troops. But these are going to be focusing on primarily helping to rebuild the Air Force. For Afghanistan, they currently don't have a very strong one, and they're not going to get a very strong one until at least 2020. And then also trying to double the amount of special operations forces, because those are the guys that have really been bringing the fight to the Taliban and really given the Afghan government an opportunity to stabilize the country.
So we can expect to see more U.S. boots on the ground there.
Launch. Catch. Repeat. Jets for the USS George H.W. Bush conducted the first American airstrikes against Islamic State militants in 2014. And 2.5 years and thousands of airstrikes later, the Bush is again a hub for the U.S. offensive. Navy officials say they've carried out about 16 strikes per day on average since arriving, and they've been using F-18 fighter jets like the one coming in right here. For pilots aboard the carrier, the hours can be long.
It's been about 12 days, so that's about the longest we'd ever go between without having a no-fly day.
But the mission remains clear.
We're very proud and happy to be out here bringing the fight to those guys.
Sailors worked late into the night targeting Islamic State militants. And while the carrier's captain says the operational pace is perfect, during a stop at his quarters, he told VOA they can do more if needed.
So in terms of the number of sorties that we could generate per day or the amount of ordnance that each aircraft is carrying, we're not approaching our top end capacity right now.
One advantage of having a carrier in the Mediterranean: some Islamic State targets are a shorter flight from here than from land bases in the region that host U.S. military aircraft. The carrier also helps diffuse the fight's workload across the military branches. But even when launching strikes by sea, allies in the fight remain essential.
As we fly our route up through Turkey, then our drop-off into northern Syria and into northern Iraq come out of Turkey. So we have to have that airspace to be able to do this job.
The sailors get a quick break during a port stop in Greece, resetting ahead of more strikes from the Mediterranean and eventually the Persian Gulf. Carla Babb, VOA News, aboard the USS George H.W. Bush. It was a big shakeup just hours before Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis arrived here in Kabul. The Minister of Defense and the Army Chief resigned. That is due to an attack a few days ago where 140 people were killed at a regional headquarters for the Army in Mazar al-Sharif. About 10 Taliban militants entered. They were disguised as Afghan Army members, and they got in because they were saying that they had a wounded soldier that needed immediate attention. They made it through 2 checkpoints before they were stopped, but then they went on a rampage and several people were killed. This was, in fact, the deadliest attack on a base here in Afghanistan in 16 years. Sources are telling me here that President Ghani has appointed an interim Minister of Defense. His name is General Tariq Shah Bahrami. It is not clear at this time if he met with Mattis today, but Mattis did meet with President Ashraf Ghani, and he also met with his commander on the ground, General John Nicholson, to talk about the ways forward for security in Afghanistan. One important thing to note: officials tell me that nothing big is going to be announced out of this trip today because the Pentagon is still working with the White House and Congress to finalize Afghanistan policy and the financial commitments before moving forward on any final plans. Reporting here in Kabul at Resolute Support Headquarters, I'm Carla Babb, VOA News.
What's behind this family feud, and what's the U.S. involvement in all of this? To help us out with that, we are joined once again by VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb and by our White House Bureau Chief Steve Herman. I thank you both for sticking around for a second segment here. Now, to both of you, before we get started, because I get a lot of questions on this, let's clear this up. What is the correct pronunciation of Qatar?
Qatar.
Is it Qatar or?
I would go with Qatar.
So if you go with Qatar.
Right. I lived there for a couple of weeks, and when I was in Doha, the locals would say Qatar. But it is an American English pronunciation to say Qatar. So technically, either pronunciation
So what do you
correct.
call the people who live in Qatar?
Qatari.
Qatari. Is that how we pronounce it? Qatari. Okay.
That's close enough. It's hard to get Arabic into English.
Steve, okay, so let's drill down into this issue. What are you making of this Arab split, and why are these 4 countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt, ganging up all of a sudden on Qatar?
Well, this is the Middle East, and nothing's black and white. And there's an old phrase that my enemy's enemy is my friend. There are lots of frenemies, enemies, friends in that area. But I think one objective assessment would be that Qatar has been perceived as punching way above its weight for many years, for many reasons, trying to play all sides, and that has caused resentment. There's a lot more to it, but that's a very simple explanation.
But that answers a lot, though. But Carla, we do know that one of the complaints is that Qatar is close to Iran. It's very supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood and of course, Hamas. But what are the facts, actually, regarding its terrorist inclinations when it comes to groups like Al-Qaeda or Islamic State?
Well, you mentioned all the connections that we know. So when it comes to the Islamic State, Qatar has actually not really had any sort of support for Islamic State that we know of. In fact, Doha has actually sent some of its force out on patrols over Syria in support of this counter-Islamic State coalition. So no ties there. When it comes to Al-Qaeda, however, it's a little more muddy because of their association with the Taliban. And Qatar has an area which is considered a political office for the Taliban there. They're using this, they say, to start conversations between the Taliban and the United States and the Afghan government. But there is that support there that Secretary Mattis calls gray funding. And it's not black, it's not white, it's not directly giving support to Al-Qaeda, but it ends up in this nebulous area where the funding can get to that terror group. But it's interesting to point that out because they're not the only ones doing that. In fact, there are members of Congress right here in the United States that say Saudi Arabia did that and helped inadvertently fund the attacks on September 11th, 2001.
So how does Saudi Arabia respond to those?
Well,
America's highest military honor, earned about 5 decades ago in what U.S. Army medic Jim McCloughan calls the worst 3 days of his life. It was May 1969, in the middle of the Vietnam War. McCloughan was wounded multiple times, but refused to leave his battle brothers to get medical treatment.
And I looked down and I had blood all over me, and I said, well, I'm not going. You're gonna need me.
McCloughan was one of just 89 men battling against 2,000 Vietnamese enemy fighters.
I don't know how they didn't finish us off, to tell you the truth. There was so many of them, they were everywhere.
Joe Middendorf provided cover for McCloughan, known simply as Doc to his fellow soldiers, as the medic dashed into the line of fire time and again to carry his wounded comrades back to safety.
Seeing Doc run out there like that was just unbelievable. You know, not many people do that.
Bill Arnold was one of 10 men saved by McCloughan. Thrown from his helicopter, going into shock and unable to move, Arnold looked up and saw the unexpected.
What the hell would anybody be running into the line of fire? You know, it was Doc. He coming after me.
In those final hours, a helicopter sent to save the men was unable to land.
When that helicopter pulled out, all hope vanished with it. And it got almost like silent, you know, eerie.
Short on bullets, with no food or water, McCloughan thought of his family and prayed.
Lord, if you get me out of this hell on earth so that I can tell my dad face to face again that I love him and give him a hug, I'll be the best dad, the best coach, and the best teacher than I could ever be.
McCloughan and many of his battlemates did make it out alive that day. He went on to pursue the career put on hold by the Vietnam War, teaching and coaching for many years. Now, he can add the title American Hero to his many accomplishments. Carla Babb, VOA News, The Pentagon.
Is there a common theme here? Do you think he's sending us a message?
I think he definitely wants to send a message. He has proposed the next budget to be increased by $54 billion for the military. And this was the president's way of saying, I want to make the military bigger. He even pointed out, he said that the Navy had shrunk and that it was going to be the largest that they had seen in a while. That is his focus. He wants to make sure that the military is so strong that no one will try to mess with the United States. And he has wanted to increase the Navy from about 275 ships in its fleet to about 350. That's where the Navy wants to be too. But the Vice Chief of the Navy has issued a little bit of caution because he says the Navy has to maintain the 275 ships that it has first before it can add on additional ships. And so when asked for what they need for supplemental money for this year, the Navy requested about $2 billion of additional funding for maintenance and fleet operations. Yes, they did request a few ships as well, and yes, they did request about 25 more of those F-18s that you saw shooting off the carrier to help with the counter-ISIS fight, but the big focus for them is maintenance.
I don't know if you know the answer to this, but what's a Navy carrier ship worth? What does it cost to build those things?
Oh, it's the most expensive ship on the planet. In fact, the Gerald R. Ford that President Trump was on Thursday is the biggest, most expensive ship to date.
And this is